On this Wednesday night, the misery over money. Canada's inflation rate skyrockets to a 39-year high.
Everything is more expensive.
How rising costs are eroding peace of mind. A powerful earthquake pummels a part of Afghanistan.
It's in a country that's already on the brink.
The staggering death toll and devastation. Damning claims and denials. The allegations of interference in the Nova Scotia massacre investigation. And hotshot.
It speaks volume of his character and his resilience and his perseverance.
A Montreal teen's journey to the NBA.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Nitu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Inflation anxiety is accelerating across Canada tonight. Consumer demand is driving up the price of just about everything. The latest data shows inflation has now climbed to a level not seen in nearly 40 years, reaching 7.7% in May, the largest spike since 1983. A major factor is the price of gas, up a whopping 48% compared to a year ago. With everyone's budgets being squeezed, experts say it's time to eliminate unnecessary spending, and there are growing fears the rampaging inflation could tip the economy into a recession. So how do Canadian families navigate the rising costs? Tonight, Gaviola takes a deep dive into that and why consumers will continue to feel the financial pinch.
The rising cost of living has gone from being a fact of life or mild annoyance to the main source of financial anxiety, and there's no escaping it.
Housing prices are out of control, car prices are out of control, grocery prices are ticking higher.
85% of respondents to a new Ipsos poll done exclusively for Global News are stressed their income won't keep up with inflation. Women, who as a group earn less than their male counterparts, are more likely to worry their wages won't keep pace with the rising cost of everything. Unsurprisingly, low-income households making less than $40,000 annually are feeling the most stress, with more than 90% worried, significantly more than the 8 in 10 households making between $60,000 and $100,000. 93% of those in their prime working years fret about it, more than the 82% of workers aged 18 to 34.
There's a generational divide where their parents or grandparents might be looking at this and they're fine because they have had the increase in their housing prices over the last number of years happen, and they're less worried about it.
With food inflation one of the biggest contributors to overall inflation, it's no surprise households with more mouths to feed are most concerned. 72% of families with kids are stressed about inflation, compared with 57% of households without children. And none of this happens in a vacuum. The stock market is selling off and volatile, and more than 70% believe interest rates will rise quicker than they'll be able to adjust, leaving many families to make hard choices on where to cut back.
There are other things that you should be saving for, like retirement, your kids' education, paying down your own student loans, for example. And those things tend to go by the wayside when everything snowballs into just being more expensive overall.
For some households, tough financial choices mean a staycation instead of a vacation abroad. Others will choose which bills get paid and which ones don't. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
In the U.S., President Joe Biden is hoping to ease the financial pressure on Americans by suspending the federal gas tax. Biden is calling on Congress to put a 3-month pause on federal gas and diesel taxes. He's also asking states to suspend their own gas taxes or provide similar relief. And Biden is urging energy companies to increase refining capacity. The measures are aimed at bringing down the country's soaring energy prices, but are expected to face opposition in Congress. To Afghanistan now, where a powerful earthquake has caused widespread death and destruction in the country's east, killing 1,000 people. A toll that will likely rise as crews comb the rubble in remote areas. The disaster compounds a hunger crisis and economic collapse that followed the frantic withdrawal of U.S.-led troops last year. Redmond Shannon has more.
The desperate search for survivors in the hours after a magnitude 6 earthquake. Most of the death and devastation is in the remote eastern Paktika province, along the Pakistan border. The injured carried to helicopters in blankets.
There's no sophisticated equipment up in these villages. These are people who lived hand to mouth.
Many of the dead reportedly children, asleep. when the earthquake hit.
These are very simple homes made of mud bricks that crumble really, really easily. And so we're deeply concerned that there are still people underneath the rubble that haven't been rescued yet.
It was so dangerous. We left home immediately, says this man. A lot of people were injured. It is the deadliest earthquake in Afghanistan in at least 2 decades, felt as far away as India. The devastation compounding an ongoing drought, a hunger crisis and the economic collapse following the departure of US-led troops last year. Since the Taliban took over, the West has withdrawn state aid in protest against the regime's human rights policies, including its ban on girls attending high school.
All the development agencies, or most of them, left Afghanistan. So what it means concretely for the population is additional challenges to face on a daily basis.
It's left a desperately poor country even less able to deal with a disaster like this. Countries like Canada only send humanitarian aid via organisations like the UN.
What I've said to all my counterparts in the House of Commons is I'm willing to work with them to find a solution. Meanwhile, there is an earthquake that just happened. We need to make sure that aid is sent, and we'll work with the UN.
Before any extra international aid arrives, it is feared the death toll will rise. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
More than a dozen Conservative MPs welcomed key figures of the so-called freedom movement to Parliament Hill. The visitors included James Topp, who recently walked from BC to Ottawa to protest vaccine mandates, and Tom Marazzo, a key spokesperson for the convoy protests in Ottawa earlier this year. They were greeted by several Conservative MPs, including leadership candidate Leslyn Lewis and Saskatchewan MP Jeremy Patzer.
The reality is there's one political party that has been represented around this table here today. There's one political party that has stood up in the House of Commons from before the last election, last federal election, and stood up and spoke on the position that you guys are here with today. You do have allies. You've had allies all along.
Patzer's comments came moments after Marazzo suggested Canada is on what he called a dark path, showing similarities to countries about to descend into, quote, civil war. A spokesperson for opposition leader Candice Bergen's office said they were aware of the event but had no hand in setting it up. The organizers said their intentions for future demonstrations are peaceful, as Ottawa braces for another protest scheduled for Canada Day. The Liberal government and head of the RCMP are denying there was any political interference in the investigation of Canada's worst mass shooting, the 2020 killings in Portapique, Nova Scotia. The opposition and even the Liberals' allies, the NDP, are now calling for a larger investigation into claims RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki pushed for more information to be released to help the government further their gun control agenda. Ross Lord reports.
They are damning allegations.
It's sickening to think that they're using the worst mass shooting in Canadian history for political gain, but it is very possible.
Allegations the government denies.
At no point, Mr. Speaker, did our government pressure or interfere in the operational decisions of the RCMP.
At the center of the controversy, the Portapique gunmen's weapons, most unregistered and smuggled into Nova Scotia from the United States. The public inquiry investigating the massacre revealed handwritten notes from RCMP Superintendent Darren Campbell that indicate Commissioner Brenda Lucki pressured Nova Scotia Mounties to reveal more details about the weapons at public briefings.
She conveyed that she had that they had disobeyed her instructions to include specific information on the firearms used by the perpetrator, and that she had promised Minister Blair and the Prime Minister's office that they would release information that was tied to pending gun control legislation.
In a written statement, Commissioner Lucki insists, "I did not interfere in the ongoing investigations into the largest mass shooting in Canadian history." She says she should have been more sensitive in her approach to the meeting in question, and that "I regret the way I approached the meeting and the impact it had on those in attendance." Bill Blair, who was Public Safety Minister at the time of the massacre, insists there was nothing nefarious.
There was no pressure placed upon the RCMP and no interference with their operational decisions. This is actually an important line between government and the operations of the police commissioner and the RCMP. It's a line that has always been respected.
Not exactly. In 1997, the office of Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was blamed for interfering with police operations that included RCMP pepper spraying protesters at an economic summit in Vancouver. The current allegations are not going away. Even the NDP, which has formally agreed to support the Liberal government for the next 3 years, is calling for an emergency meeting of the Commons Public Safety Committee. Ross Lord, Global News.
South of the border, the school where 19 children and 2 teachers were gunned down last month will be demolished. The mayor of Uvalde, Texas, made the announcement last night, but did not give a timeline for when Robb Elementary School will be torn down. For the first time in decades, major legislation on gun control in the U.S. could be put to a vote this week. The Senate has reached a bipartisan deal on a gun violence bill. It includes measures to tighten background checks, bolster spending for school safety, and tougher penalties for gun traffickers. Allegations of torture coming up. Ukrainian prisoners of war with disturbing claims against Russian forces. The UN estimates more than 4,600 civilians have been killed since Russia invaded Ukraine in late February. But that number doesn't include the staggering toll on Ukrainian soldiers and those taken as prisoners of war. Human rights watchers say Ukrainians in detention could number 6,000, and those lucky enough to be released are now speaking out about their experiences. Sean O'Shea spoke to one of them.
You were beaten for pleasure.
Yes.
He asked us not to show his face, agreed to speak to us if we didn't use his name. Then he emotionally described what he and others went through at the hands of Russian soldiers.
They use electroshock on genitals.
He signed up just after the invasion. His military unit was surrounded by the enemy, and they surrendered. He spent 3 weeks as a prisoner of war. The torture techniques they used, he told us, weren't just painful. During 10 minutes of physical torture, he said, a man with us died. Human rights watchers say they've heard accounts from soldiers and civilians alike.
Every person who was interviewed by our NGO told us about the torture in the Russian captivity.
In Ukrainian areas now controlled by Russians,
ordinary men who were walking across the street and abducted by Russians.
Volodymyr Zolkin is a blogger and journalist who says he's seen videos of captured Ukrainians who've been tortured. As for Russians captured by Ukraine, he's managed to interview those soldiers on video and even contacted the soldiers' families.
Stupid!
He says families and soldiers have been brainwashed by Russian propaganda. He says he feels pity for some of the Russian soldiers who were tricked to join the fighting.
What would you like Canadians to know about the way the Russians are treating the Ukrainians, the civilians in this war?
Russians want to destroy all our lives. They want to kill everyone. If they can, they kill every Ukrainian. I want Canadians to know that we will resist and we will fight until our win, until we defeat this evil.
This man got out in a prisoner swap. His legs, injured by an exploded grenade, are slowly healing. And over lunch at his home, that prisoner of war told us something else, that despite the conditions he faced in captivity, once his injuries are better, he says he wants to return to the front lines to continue defending his country, which is still under attack. Nitu.
Sean O'Shea in Kharkiv, Ukraine. Thanks, Sean. Back in Canada, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky holding a virtual Q&A with university students from across the country. Students say the opportunity to hear from the wartime leader was inspiring. And while Zelensky expressed gratitude for their support, he also stressed his country's need for more help. Heather Yurex-West reports.
Ilya Yankue is studying at the University of Calgary, but his heart is back in Ukraine.
For me, specifically, it was really hard because my father is in Ukraine armed forces, and he was directly on the front line.
Yankue looks towards a day he can return armed with his education back home.
When you look
at your children.
Speaking live to an audience of a dozen Canadian universities Wednesday, the Ukraine president said the country will need people like him soon.
Do come back with the state-of-art knowledge and with the willingness to live and build independent Ukraine. And we are standing here for this, I'm sure.
Speaking via video link, Zelensky lamented how much things had changed since his visit to Toronto in 2019. The year, he said, the Toronto Raptors surprised everyone with a championship victory, just as Ukraine is surprising much of the world now.
This is when you win, when no one is expecting you to win. By bringing together and uniting, you do things that seem to be impossible.
Canada's Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland also watched the president's address with students at the University of Toronto.
We heard President Zelensky say that what Ukraine needs is money, it needs weapons, and it needs ever stronger sanctions against Russia. We agree.
And my question is...
After speaking, the president took questions from Canadian students. Ukraine exchange student Katerina Nekumyaj says hearing directly from Zelensky meant a lot.
I felt really proud for our people, for our president. I felt really grateful to everyone who helps Ukraine and supports it.
Thank you very much.
A rare opportunity to speak with a wartime president these students aren't likely to forget. Heather Urex West, Global News, Calgary.
Still ahead, what's on Trudeau's agenda for the Commonwealth Summit in Rwanda?
You're watching Global National.
The federal government is freezing funding for Hockey Canada over its handling of sexual assault allegations. The decision to cut the funding comes just 2 days after Hockey Canada executives testified on Parliament Hill about the organization's handling of a sexual assault complaint involving members of the 2018 World Junior Men's Team. In the last 2 years, Hockey Canada received $14 million from the federal government. The Trudeau government says Canada will open an embassy in the Rwandan capital of Kigali, the first stop in a trio of international summits for the Prime Minister. His government says it hopes to strengthen diplomatic relations in the region. Our chief political correspondent David Aiken is traveling with the Prime Minister. David, what can we expect on this international trip?
Well, Neetu, this is the first of 3 summits the Prime Minister will engage in over the next 10 days. With all the crises in the world, they are all important. Here in Kigali, Justin Trudeau will have face-to-face meetings with many of the Commonwealth leaders who have yet to denounce Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Prime Minister's officials telling us that the Prime Minister will have some, quote, frank conversations to connect the dots between Russia's invasion, food shortages, supply chain issues, and inflation.
Well, I think that's why it's important to be here, to hear their perspective, to engage.
It may be tough to find consensus. India, for example, has yet to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, he is not at this summit. Officials, in fact, worry that there may not even be a mention of Ukraine in the summit's final communique. Now, there's 54 members of the Commonwealth, but 32 are small island states in the Pacific and Caribbean. Their top issue, climate change. It is literally an existential issue for many of these states, some of which could literally be underwater within decades. They are looking for wealthy countries like Canada, like the UK, to help with financing they need to adapt to rising sea levels and deal with ever more destructive hurricanes and typhoons. Finally, Justin Trudeau and other leaders have been put on notice by some activist groups like Amnesty International to confront the human rights record of their host, Rwanda Prime Minister Paul Kagame. Kagame's government has been accused of illegally jailing its critics, torturing some critics, and even engaging in some extrajudicial killings. Now, officials from the PMO say that Trudeau will not hesitate to bring these matters up when Trudeau and Kagame meet later this week. Neetu.
David Aiken in Rwanda. Thanks, David. Next, the high-flying hopes for a Montreal teen trailblazer at the NBA draft. The NBA draft is tomorrow night, and one of the most highly touted prospects is a Canadian. 19-year-old Benedict Mathurin from Montreal seems destined for stardom. With his smooth shots and thunderous dunks, he's the latest in what some are calling the golden age of Canadian basketball. Dan Spector has more on Mathurin's talent with the ball and how he's shown strength off the court.
He may not be a household name yet, but a whole lot more Canadians are about to get acquainted with 19-year-old Benedict Mathurin. Better known south of the border as Ben Mathurin, the Montreal native regularly made crowds go wild while starring for the University of Arizona for the past 2 seasons. Thursday night, Mathurin is a lock to be picked high in the NBA draft.
Top 6 at the very least.
Former Canadian national team member Dwight Walton says Mathurin will make an instant impact in the NBA.
His metrics are off the chart. He is NBA ready now.
But long before he was electrifying packed stadiums in college, Mathurin played on this court in Montreal North, one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. He followed his older sister Jennifer, an elite basketball player in her own right.
I'm just really proud.
The game helped Jen and Ben cope with the loss of their brother, who died at 15 in a bicycle accident just under a decade ago. Mathurin choosing to work even harder to honor his fallen sibling.
I think it speaks volume of his character and his resilience and his perseverance.
Now Ben is set to make the ultimate leap, as more and more Canadians have been doing in recent years.
Oh, without question, it's a golden age.
Ontario-born NBA stars like Andrew Wiggins and Jamal Murray are among those cementing Canada's reputation as a basketball powerhouse. But Quebec has been catching up, with Chris Boucher, Luguentz Dort, and now Mathurin all coming out of Montreal North.
I think that's going to just catapult basketball more and give kids more of a chance.
Mathurin says he hopes his story convinces other kids to believe in themselves, even when nobody else does. Dan Spector, Global News, Montreal.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday night. I'm Neetu Garcha. Tonight's Your Canada is this rainbow over Toronto. We love to see your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Farah Nasser will be at the anchor desk tomorrow. Have a great night.